So what are the pattern that you can find in time series data? So depending on the frequency of the data, so which could be hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly. Sometime your time series data could look like this. Sometime it could look like this. Okay. Sometime it could be straight line. Sometime very random, something like that, completely random. So this is totally constant. We cannot do anything about it. This is very cyclical. That means there is a clear pattern, but it's very predictable. You actually don't need a sophisticated time series model for all these things. This is very predictable series. This is somewhat difficult to predict. So probably this is one series where you need time series model, and this one which is completely random. When the series is completely random, you cannot actually predict anything. I mean, you cannot predict anything. So you probably have a downward sloping time series data. We are using the GDP data for one of the state in India. So this is a downward sloping from 1961 to 2001. So you can say downward sloping data for GDP, and there will be an upward sloping data. So this is the typical example of an upward sloping data. Could be mix of both upward sloping and downward sloping. That could also be there, right? So this is a typical case where initially there was a downward slope and then there is an upward slope, right? So this could also be one of the these are different scenarios or different types of time series that you probably will come across in real time scenarios. The different components to time series data. Okay, so there are different components, and it can be broadly classified into trend, seasonal, cyclical, and the random components. So what is a trend? We say trend, what comes to our mind is that either it's upward trend or it's downward trend. So if you use the definition, it's just a long-term pattern, right? It's just a long-term pattern in the data. Either it's upward, downward, or a mix of both upward, downward. So that's, we call it as trend. And then we call it seasonal. Pattern is nothing but something that appears in regular interval, wherein the frequency of the occurrences is within a year or even shorter. For example, quarterly GDPs, or maybe sales. So seasonal could be if you use sales data. So every December, right? Every December there is a peak, because December is the holiday season, right? So you will see that sales data for most consumer companies or e-commerce companies in the month of festivals is actually at a very high level, or there is a peak at this month. So we call that seasonal data. That means it happens only in a particular season, and it should repeat within a year or less. If it is happening over more than 2 years, 1 year, it's not. I mean, by definition, it's not seasonal, right? We'll see what that case mean. So next one is cyclical, right? This is also a repeated pattern, but this could go beyond 1 year, right? So this is one. The pattern could be more than 1 year. So typical examples could be, the budget, right? The budget doesn't happen on a particular month of a year in every country. It could actually change. There could be a random budget as well, best if the government really changes within a year. So there is no particular time period, but you can see that because of some economics scenario, or inflation or recession, something like that, or some monetary policy, you see some sort of wave-like pattern. Cycles are not regular. That means you don't see it at a very regular interval of time. It's also related to cases where it happens with a number of other cases, like economic recession, inflation, you know some monetary policy changes in the country, and so on. So some factor really affects this. So it's not just because of some, like, festivals or something. Festivals are uh, already pre-decided, right? But budgets are not. Budget could happen, or budget decision of coming up a new budget is actually random, right? Government decides when it's going to come up with a budget. So that's cyclical. And the last pattern is the random, and this is the easiest to understand. So random is like anything that cannot be cannot have a particular pattern. So the idea behind univariate time series is that to use the past values of the series data to forecast future, right? So what are the variables of interest? It could be stock price, it could be GDP, it could be sales, and so on. You can use it for variety of purposes. Whether you are working in a company, you are working in a bank, anywhere where you have time series data available, you can use this. And so some of the important uses of time series forecasting is forecasting inflation. So most central banks used ARIMA forecasting or time series forecasting for forecasting inflation rate, unemployment rate, and so on, or even exchange rate, and so on. Uh, and then companies also use for sales forecasting. Finance company could use for interest rate forecasting, and so on.